All right, boys and girls, we are back for another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Happy to be talking today from the Hoover Institution over at Stanford University with Scott Atlas, the doctor and former head of neurology at Stanford University Medical School. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, sir.
Sure, thanks, Ben. And just minor correction, I was the head of neuroradiology.
Neuroradiology. You know what? I corrected myself before when I wrote that down in my notes.
My friends in neurology would
botched.
be irritated.
I think that people have probably seen you in recent weeks talking with a number of different folks on TV and on cable news about your frustrations with what you're seeing in the way that the United States is currently handling this conversation about school reopenings. That matters a ton to all the different people who are parents, particularly of kids who are in K through 12. It matters not just for their own educational development and their health, but also obviously for the economy and the ability of their parents to work. Tell us a little bit about what your frustrations are and what would bring you to compare yourself to being in a Kafka novel when it came to this debate.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have said that, but actually it's very true. And if nothing else, at least the kids who are forced and locked out of school, that should be number one on their reading list, The Trial by Franz Kafka. They can understand the absurdity of the days that we're living in. But seriously, I think that the school issue really, to me, can be summed up with the following. Point number one, we know that this disease, the children have extremely low risk from COVID-19. That is factually true, and it is indisputable. And in fact, it's factually true. They have far less risk from COVID-19 than from seasonal influenza that they are exposed to every year. That's point number one. Point number two is there are extremely harmful things to children from school closure, including, but not even the most important, that distance learning is an abject failure. And then point number three, and I can articulate all the details of these points. Point number three is that there is nothing more important to the United States than educating our children. It is an absolute, urgent, top priority. And when you say those three things, there is no argument to keep schools closed, none. Now, point number, all of those things considered, there's icing on the cake. And the icing on the cake is that all over the world, from data all over the world, we know that children are not super spreaders, that children do not spread the disease as much as adults. That's what the world's data shows. We do not say that we are all about the science and then act contrary to the science. That's very frustrating to me. I like to live in a rational world. I try to live my life that way. Of course, I'm not always rational when it comes to things like rooting for, sports teams and things. But, in all seriousness, this is so important. And so, again, we're about to commit a massive error here by implementing a policy of stopping COVID-19 at all costs without talking about the harms of the policy. And in this case, the policy is school closure.
I'm worried about a number of different aspects of this debate, but one that has really been of concern to me is that in so many other areas, I feel like we see the argument that we should base our assumptions and our policy decisions on the science that we see, the data that is in front of us from around the world and from experiences in schools in Europe and elsewhere, as you say, are pretty clearly all on one side of this. And yet from the way that the media talks about this debate, it suggests that if there's any risk whatsoever to teachers involved here, that means that we have to, of a necessity, keep millions upon millions of children stuck at home and not learning in an environment that, frankly, can do damage not just to their educational future, but to their health as well. Why is the conversation about this so skewed? Is it just partisan politics, or is there something else at play?
Well, I happen to think that people are genuinely afraid. And again, I've said many times, I'm empathetic to the fear. And it sort of shows you when we get away from this and we'll look back at this, the power of fear in motivating behavior and pointing out, actually, if you think about it, the danger of things like biological warfare and things. I
Hmm.
mean, there's never been a time, I don't think, where the governments just said, okay, we're locking everyone down. You're confined essentially to your homes. We're stopping all business. We're shutting all schools. And people acquiesced to that
Hmm.
because they were afraid. So what we see now is a very important, because it is true. It's okay that teachers are afraid, but I think fear is from, frankly, not knowing the facts, and ignorance and uncertainty is adding to the fear. So let me articulate what we know. First of all, teaching is a young profession. In the United States, K through 12 teachers are generally young. Half of them are under 41, 82% are under 55. Okay, these are not high risk age groups. When we look at the data shows that people that are under 55 have less than or equal to seasonal flu risk. And so the overwhelming majority of teachers are not at high risk. Are there teachers at high risk? Of course there are. There are overweight, diabetic teachers with kidney failure. Okay, we know that, and we want to protect them. Everyone wants to stop high-risk people from getting exposure. There's no question about that. And the same, by the way, there are a small number of there are high-risk children. Of course, we have to protect them. I think it's sort of that's the sort of a straw man argument. No one's saying that we're not protecting those high-risk people. And for those teachers who are high risk, they can use social distancing. We understand social distancing. They can be 6 feet, they can be 10 feet from children. We can accommodate high risk people. And if they're still afraid, my opinion is high risk teachers should have the option, just like high risk students, of learning from home, teaching from home, using the distance learning that we know isn't very good, but it's a lot better than nothing.
Hmm.
But there's even more to it than that. You have to understand, again, it's not just that, okay, distance learning isn't as good for children. That's not the issue here. The issue is the following: closing schools is super, super harmful. First of all, we know that all of us who are parents, and I happen to be a parent, we know that children learn most of what they learn in school from not lists of things or books that you can get over the internet or learn online. It's the social engagement. It's learning how to work in groups. It's mingling with other people who may or may not be your friends. It's understanding conflict resolution. This is maturation. You can't learn that on a computer. And the other things are, we learn when kids need glasses, when kid needs hearing aid. You can't learn that. You're not going to learn that on a computer. We also know that there's a massive amount of child abuse happening. Not every family is the affluent family with a second home in the Hamptons here.
Hmm.
Or, in California, going to, okay, we'll get the neighborhood together and all these post-college degreed parents can get a group together and everybody gets an iPad. That's not the real world. The real world is that in 2 months of lockdown, there's a study that estimated that 210,000 reported cases of child abuse that would have been picked up didn't get picked up. Why? Because we know factually that the number one agency for reporting child abuse is the schools. You close the schools, you don't see that. We know that suicide hotline calls are up 300%, 900%. Sexual abuse calls are going way up. We know this from reports all over the country. Opioid deaths are going up. Don't forget, the lower income groups, half the people who make under $40,000 a year lost their jobs. That kind of stress, that's not good. And you don't have to be a scientist to understand that when you close schools, you're generating massive harms to the children. This is even separate from the economic downstream impact of locking up parents. I'm just talking about, if you care about children, you literally must open the schools. The second point about the risk to teachers, that was all under point number one. Sorry, long-winded. But the second point under risk to teachers is the following. Every year, from November to April, we have flu season. every year, 35, 50,000, 90,000 people in the US die every single year from the flu. Who dies? Mainly 70% of the deaths are in the same high-risk people that we're talking about here. We don't lock down schools, even though kids get the flu. By the way, kids die from the flu, and kids transmit the flu like crazy to the high-risk people. We never, ever lock down schools. We don't do anything. We don't wear masks walking around to protect high-risk teachers. I understand, and of course, that this disease has a much higher fatality rate for high risk than the flu for the high-risk people. No one's saying that. But the point is, every year, even with a vaccine, we're getting 50,000, 60,000 deaths a year, and it's the high-risk groups. Why don't we lock down schools November through April? Why? Where were these points? Where was the logic here? Every year, even with the vaccine.
You know, I am personally, I hear a lot of folks say things like, well, you know, but parents are concerned, and everyone wants to get back to school, but you know, there's this implication among our leadership class, mostly politicians, but others as well, that it seems to indicate, well, don't worry, things will get back to normal soon enough. You know, we could just kick the can a couple of months, or we can kick the can a couple of weeks, and things will eventually get back to normal. We'll have a vaccine, we'll have treatment, we'll have this, that, and the other. That's something that people have been hearing now for months, and have this kind of false, I feel like, feeling that they are going to be able to get back to normal, you know, just around the corner. Now that we're finally approaching a real decision point for these politicians, and a lot of them are saying, well, we're going to go back to virtual through January, I worry that people have received a lot of different assumptions that aren't really based in reality, in terms of having to live with this and deal with this for quite some time before you know, any successful vaccine is able to be widely deployed. What should they know about that side of things?
Sure. This is very important for people to understand. Number one, it is absolutely true that the administration has done an incredible job of facilitating, expediting, getting rid of the red tape for vaccine development and for drug treatment and explorations of drug treatments. There's no question about that a lot of the red tape, this is record time, and that's undeniable. They've done a great job. And by the way, hats off to, again, the private sector in healthcare in the United States, because, you know, it's an illustration of how incredible what's happening here is in this kind of, you know, massive progress, really, that was unanticipated in vaccine development. We don't have the vaccine yet, okay, but there's a lot of things going on, including one from the UK, by the way. It's not just the US. But here's the point about the vaccines. People have it's like become a myth here, or totally a sort of a lack of reality and understanding what's going on. The flu vaccine, let's just take as an example, is 40 to 60% effective. That's on the CDC website. Sometimes it's less than that in certain studies. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two, let's look at the flu vaccine in real world data. In 2017-18, in one of the bad flu seasons, in California, because I happen to have the data, I'm not cherry picking, it's not easy to find a lot of data. So you have to work hard. And what I find is that in California, 50% of the people who died from the flu had the vaccine themselves. Okay, so, you know, that's sort of staggering. I think people have no idea about that. There's this sort of false expectation that there's this magic wand of a vaccine coming. Even if the vaccine was here, okay, it's a big step. There's no question. I mean, I'm not downplaying the vaccine. I'm just saying, you know, there should be no predicate for a vaccine or anything else to open the schools. One reason, as I just said, is the vaccine is, you know, okay, it's a significant thing, but it's no magic wand. Two, we don't know when the vaccine is going to be actually available. It could be available this year. I'm hoping it is. Everyone's hoping it is. Everyone's hoping we can get all the doses and then get it implemented. It's not trivial, But we don't need a vaccine to open the schools for the three reasons that must be repeated over and over again. Children are at extremely low risk, much less than the flu. It's massively harmful to children to keep the schools closed. I don't care about a vaccine here. This is really not a reason to hold off schools. We're destroying people's lives here. And number three, there is nothing more important in the United States, there is nothing more important in the United States than educating our children. If I were, my kids are they're out of college, they're in their 20s now. And I could tell you that President Trump yesterday, I think it was, or the day before, I lose track of days, was saying, he was asked, would you be comfortable sending your kid? Of course he'd be comfortable. Every parent should be comfortable here, and not only comfortable, they should be pounding down the doors here to get schools open.
The American Association of Pediatrics put out their own guidance on this that was much more focused than the CDC guidance, which seemed to be just a lengthy list of bureaucratic expectations that frankly, other people that I've interviewed have said, it would be impossible to open a school and abide by what the CDC is demanding in terms of their list. Is this a situation where the level of back and forth among experts about what's right to do that has so lowered, I think, the American people's faith in expertise on this, that's leading us to a point where it's very difficult to form guidance that can be abided by among the public schools without it becoming a political or policy football?
I think you're pointing out something very important here, which is that the faith and trust in real experts and expertise and even data has been damaged. It's a big sort of part of the roadkill here. Mm-hmm. And we will learn about that and discuss it, I think, in a little bit once we're a little bit further past this. But this is very true, because what's happened is a lot of smart people have engaged in a lot of sloppy thinking. And of course, people are experts in all this on their CVs, on their resumes, and they're very smart people. And I'm a professor, at Stanford. I see my friends who may or may not agree with me. They're not. It's not that they're not smart, but you have to go beyond superficial thinking here. You don't just basically. In fact, this is what I always say: the most important thing we can teach our children is to use critical thinking here. And we're not only avoiding it by eliminating the schools, we're showing them to not use critical thinking. It's not about the bottom line data. You have to read the study. You have to think through here what's actually going on. You have to consider all options. Public policy is far more than caution and fear. Public policy is integrating a lot of information and then formulating it, looking at what the policies are going to do. And so it's the experts are saying things. They have been infected by fear, in my opinion. They're not using critical thinking here. There's so many things that are not good studies that are published in the world's best journals, for example, New England Journal, Lancet, Nature. Repeatedly, these are I've reviewed papers. I've been on editorial boards of journals for 30 years. I know how to review papers, and the standards are amazing what's been published. And this is really a failure of critical thinking, probably out of fear. It's hard to ascribe a motive to other people, and I think it's not appropriate, really, at least for me. But we need to make sure that when we look at things, you're supposed to look and then question it in your own head and really analyze what's going on here. We know this is a serious problem, this coronavirus pandemic. There's no denying that. It's a lethal disease. It's a tragic loss of life among certain people, but we are not in the position we were in March. We are in a different position. We know what we're doing here. We know this disease. We know who to protect. We know who is okay with it. In fact, the overwhelming majority of people do fine with this. And so, yes, it's a problem, We need to protect the people who are at high risk. We need to avoid hospitalization overcrowding. But something that's very, very flawed was sort of perpetrated, intentionally or not, and people have this false understanding of what's going on here. Locking down does nothing to eradicate the virus.
Mhm.
We're not getting rid of the virus when we see the curve come down. That's not what's happening here. The virus is there. When you have more, it's all about what we should know now. And what we know is that when you open up and have more social mingling, we're going to get more cases. And we're going to see more cases, by the way, when we increase testing, but we're going to legitimately get more cases. And when you have a case fatality rate greater than 0, like you do with this and like you do with the flu, when you have more cases, there are going to be more deaths. The goal of policy here is not to lock down. The goal of policy is to do our best to minimize the serious damage. And that means minimize the deaths. And the administration is understanding this completely. And I think President Trump spoke about how they're going to add and double down on protecting the high-risk group, protecting the vulnerable, send prioritized testing, PPE, and all kinds of equipment to help eliminate incoming infection into nursing homes, for instance, and make sure that we can supply capacity to hospitals that need it. Right now, we're doing okay with hospital capacity, except in certain isolated places. But flattening the curve had literally nothing to do with eradicating the virus. We need to go on functioning as a society because the lockdown itself is more harmful than the virus. And this has been talked about. I wrote a paper on this, a study with several colleagues. It's also now been talked about in the UK. There was a big study that came out. People have to understand here, we need to function. We're killing people with the lockdown. This is very important. And I think the administration totally gets this, and they're absolutely right on target.
What's the thing that needed to be said differently during this process? Just to
Well,
go back, and I know that, it's 2020 hindsight and that type of thing, but people clearly took the wrong lesson from what the lockdowns were supposed to achieve. What should have been said back in March and April about the way that this played out that was different? And as part of the problem here, that because so much of our media is based in New York and was seeing what was going on in New York City as at the epicenter of this, that it led to a lot of state officials and governors and places like that across the country maybe making this decision to go into full lockdown mode much earlier than they ought to, much earlier than maybe the data suggested that they ought to, and with a kind of a lack of understanding of what those lockdowns were meant to achieve.
Yes. Here's the situation, really. The original lockdown was justified because it was a 15-day, I think, original lockdown, and we knew very little here. We had very little transparency from China. I mean, this is obvious. And the fatality rates were estimated at off-the-chart levels. We're talking 3.4%. That's just very, very frightening. And so we didn't know much. And but actually it was articulated by Dr. Birx in the early press conferences that we're slowing the spread to avoid hospital overcrowding. She was very clear on that, but that message got lost. And in New York and elsewhere, but it turned out that New York was completely out of control. And you're probably right. That's a good point. A lot of the media is out in New York, but New York is the world's greatest city. Okay, so it's very important what happens there. And what happened there was complete disaster. They were completely overrun. If you look at New York and the tri-state area as a country, or New York alone as a country, or New Jersey alone as a country, it's multiples more deaths per capita than anywhere in the world. And they were overrun. For a lot of reasons. They locked everybody down, but then 7 weeks went by before they did anything about the nursing home issue. 7 weeks after the lockdown of everyone else, where the high-risk people were honestly, we knew from the beginning, every medical student, I've said this, would have known that the high-risk people were these people. That's not new information. That's true in any viral, illness, immunocompromised people and older people with comorbidity. So your question is what should have been done or what should have been said? And I think this is very important. I actually had written a piece about this. What should have been said was, number one, I'm not talking about initially, but after we knew stuff, I'm talking about, in, like you're saying, April, May timeframe. Number one, we've learned a lot. The fatality rate is, in fact, far less, 1/10 to 1/100th of what the original expectation was. Okay, but it's not the panic situation. We've learned a lot. We know who to protect. We know it's these older people. It's really sort of unconscionable that we didn't lock down them sooner because they're already living in a restricted environment. If you've ever tried to walk into a nursing home, it should have been doable. We should have allocated resources to there and kept everyone else who was low risk. Okay, I mean, we can deal with this for them. And then we should have said that we should have very clearly pronounced the risk to children is extraordinarily low, despite the sensationalized headlines of these rare inflammatory syndromes. Okay, every doctor who has a medical perspective understands that exceptional cases exist that are tragic in every infectious disease. I mean, this is not unexpected, but that sort of was another kind of ignition on social media, and the media really did that. So we know who to protect. We've learned a lot, and actually, we are going to get more cases. I think this is very important. People somehow thought we've conquered the virus when the curves were flattened. No, we're going to reopen. We're going to get more cases. So it's really, the strategy should be a very targeted, high-level protection of the high-risk people, and understanding we need to take some precautions, but we're going to get more cases and we're going to get through this. Okay, there was a real sort of a failure, I feel, of communication of the facts. Instead of focusing on what we don't know, we know a lot. And this is not just what we've learned here. We also have decades of virology and immunology and infectious disease knowledge here. This is not something that's incredibly, we have no idea what we're doing here. We know what we're doing here. And yes, it's very dangerous for certain people. But the facts have not really been clearly communicated that we know what's going on, we know who to protect, we know the goal of the policy, and we now know also, although we could have anticipated, the harms of the lockdown. That always must be said in every policy, whether or not it's even with COVID. What are we doing to the people with the policy itself? And that was never even discussed, never.
I don't want to leave you without asking you about the situation in California, where you have a governor in Gavin Newsom who, obviously did an initial lockdown, then started to open things back up, then locked down again. You have the major public school systems in the major cities announcing that they're going to be fully virtual and online. The fear that I have really is that California is indicating to the rest of the country what they're going to experience as well. But what do you think should be altered about the approach that's going on in California leadership and the way that they're handling things?
Well, frankly, it's being handled completely incorrectly. Mm-hmm. I couldn't stress that enough. When we look at what's happening in California, first of all, the virus is there. You're going to get cases. There's some kind of bizarre focus here all over, but particularly California, that, wow, the cases are going up, better lock down. That's just again, like for all the reasons I've articulated, it's just completely incorrect. That's just not the way it should be done here. For all the reasons it's not about the cases. It's about minimizing the damage from the cases. You cannot stop the cases themselves. And you don't necessarily want to stop the cases themselves. And this is important to understand, because we know that when you get high spread through low risk groups, that's the way you get population immunity. Low risk groups spreading the illness, spreading the infection, we get population immunity. And by the way, that's probably why, despite all the protests and everything else going on in major cities, including New York. New York, I think, fingers crossed, will not get the rebound of cases that we saw in the other cities that had the protests, like LA. And I can talk about why these southern states got these cases. But I just want to point out, New York had such a out of control infection that they probably have herd immunity. And this is why they have not seen the rebound here. And that's very important. And in fact, when it was happening, I said to my wife, ironically, I said back in March when this is all happening, ironically, New York will be the safest place because it's such a disaster. Everybody got infected. They're going to have herd immunity. And we'll see if that holds up. It's hard to be a predictor and then have to change. But California is being looked at sort of nonsensically. First of all, they don't care, obviously, when they close down LA County schools because of and all over California. I mean, in my own county, Santa Clara County, which is where Stanford is, the number of cases is going up. The number of deaths, I mean, it's so small. Sometimes when there's 3, that's a spike. And then when you look at the fine print under the graphs in Santa Clara County dashboard, by the way, it says that in their deaths per day from COVID, in the fine print, it says, by the way, the deaths are not necessarily from COVID-19. Meaning they're COVID-19 positive on a test. They didn't die from COVID-19. And this is a really a serious problem with the data. Again, there's a problem here when you're categorizing every hospitalization of patients who test positive. Turns out in Arizona, for instance, 2/3 of them are not symptomatic from COVID. They're in the hospital for something else, but they're called a COVID hospitalization. Same thing with the deaths here. So there's been a really sloppy way, again, of looking at the numbers and the data. And when we look at trends, we're reacting to them with policy, which is appropriate, but you have to know what the trends are. You have to really have accurate data. So California, they're locking down things, again, totally without consideration, particularly about the schools here. They're locking down the schools without considering the harms. They're locking down the schools because there's higher cases, but there's no real significant increase in most of California in the tragic complications of the disease. The cases are not the concern. The concern should not be the cases alone. That is not a problem. And I just, again, it's almost inexplicable what's going on in California, frankly. I live in one of the most locked down counties of all. And really, there's not much going on in Santa Clara County to have that.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Atlas, for walking us through all of this. But before I let you go, do you have any real hope or optimism about what you see going forward? You mentioned one aspect of that as it relates to New York. But what is the aspect of this that you feel is giving you hope in a time in which so many people seem so frustrated and at each other's throats about what we ought to do?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this. This is super important for people to understand. I'm optimistic here of what's going on. We're going to get through this. Why am I optimistic? Because we know that the overwhelming majority of people do not have a problem with this infection. I'm looking even at the southern states, or the so-called, the hot states of Texas, Florida, Arizona. When we look at what's going on there, we see a lot of cases, but they're plateauing or actually coming down already. You're not going to hear that in the news. Somehow the news is reporting this is exploding and everything's a disaster. That's actually not true. What's going on a micro detail here is that the cases are either plateauing or coming down. In Arizona, it's something like 1/3 to 1/2% of people are symptomatic now than it was at the peak. In Texas, I just looked at this, the positive testing frequency, meaning percent of tests that are positive, is significantly less now. Things are calming down here. We're dealing with these cases. So we can deal with, the states as a whole do not have a problem with hospital capacity, and that is the goal of the policy. We're doing better with protecting the high risk because we're not seeing the explosion in deaths. We're doing better. We need to double down on that, but we're getting better. So I'm optimistic about that. I'm optimistic when I see that we're doing better with how these people are coming out once they're hospitalized. You have to realize the length of stay in the hospitals is 1/3 of what it was compared to April. The mortality rate of people who are hospitalized is 1/2 of what it was in April. The percent of people that come into the hospital that need an ICU is much less than it was in April. The percent of people that go into an ICU that actually need a ventilator is much less than it was in April. We're much better here. The age of infected person is in the 30s now on average compared to in the 60s back in March and April. And this means that we're getting better at this. We're doing better with treatment, much better. We're going to be able to handle this. And yes, we are going to come out of this. And one last point here. This is going to end up having a lot of deaths. There are more deaths to come, but this is nowhere near the number of deaths that people had predicted, and in fact are still predicting. I'm sorry, but these models are not important at this point in time, frankly. We have the data. We shouldn't be relying on models. We shouldn't make headlines from models. And we have to realize that when we come out of this, we will probably have a vaccine, but we're going to come out of this. No one knows that there's going to be a second wave. That's another a misstatement. There's somehow this idea that, oh, we know there's going to be a second wave, better be careful. That's not true. No one knows there's going to be there may be a second wave in the fall, winter, spring, but no one knows that. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it doesn't always happen. So even if it does, even if we have a second wave, we are far more prepared for what could happen. We understand how to mobilize resources. We understand how to social distance. We understand how to protect the high risk. I'm not worried about a second wave. This is not the bubonic plague here. We know what we're doing, and we've learned a tremendous amount here. And people need to really understand that we live with risks. There are risks here, but it's nowhere near the risks that has been portrayed in the past, even though it's very serious. I'm not minimizing that. Okay, but we know there are harms, and we all want to get back to work here. We all need to have a functioning society.
Dr. Scott Atlas, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. We really appreciate it.
Okay, good talking to you.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.